and reconnected it. And it makes it a Mobius strip. So now if you're looking at the matter side and you're saying, well, how in the world can it connect to mind? And you keep tracing along this thing and you find suddenly you were working on matter, but you've ended up on the mind side. Well, why is that? It's because a Mobius strip has one side. And it looks like a ribbon from a distance that has two distinct sides, but it really isn't. It's the same thing. And it looks different depending on your perspective. So when my mind is thinking about a random number generator, the mind and matter on the subjective side are actually the same thing. And so I think about a certain way, and it is expressed in a hunk of matter because the hunk of matter actually has some mind in it as well. But we don't see that. We see our own mind very clearly because of our perspective on it. We don't see that there's any mind stuff in a random number generator, but it's there.
So how a realization that there's that it's a Mobius strip. What what impact do you think that has on people, cities, countries, nations, planets? Is there some sort of scaling factor on that whole thing? Because again, people are still saying like all this stuff is great, Mobius strips, that's wonderful, but I'm still living in the world I'm living in, and trying to get a kind of a big picture of what does this really mean? Because when they first came up with the quantum stuff, it was like, what does this really mean? And 100 years later, we're still asking that question and uncovering it. So
Right.
I'm just sort of asking it again.
Well, one implication of this is that people might think, well, if my wishes really can push the world around, then how come I can't win the lottery? How come my wishes don't stop war? How come all kinds of things don't occur? And part of the answer is that each individual is a really small drop in the ocean. And so while our intentions do go out, and we see in the laboratory, we see these things in the laboratory because we're working typically with an individual and one device. And we by design, exclude the rest of the world as much as we can, although you can't really do that. That's the design of the experiment. But when you're dealing with the universe at large, and my intention does go out, it ripples out and affects the entire universe, most of the universe doesn't care. It doesn't want to respond. It's off doing its own thing. So from a perspective of thinking about everything as having some form of intentional goal, some kind of wish, whether it's an electron or human or anything, it has some kind of a push out into the world. It's all happening at once. It's all mixing together. And you need to have an enormously strong push in order for that ripple to be felt by anything, unless you happen to be predisposed towards it. So, for example, in a case of somebody, of an individual and a random number generator, I specifically focus them on that device. And I look at the device at very specific times, and I know what I'm looking for. And we see these small effects. They're there, but they're small. You can say then, well, what would happen if we had 1 billion people all doing the same task, with all focusing in on something, a random number generator or person or anything? Would you get a larger effect? And the answer is probably, but the form of intention would have to be extremely coherent in order for it to have an impact. And the reason is that you imagine that intention is a wave-like structure. If you have more than one of those waves, then the two waves can interfere. They can destroy themselves if they happen to interfere in the wrong way. So if you have 1 billion people thinking the same way, the same time, in the same manner, I imagine that you would end up with a very large effect, even in random number generators, which are just basically hunks of physical stuff that's getting pushed around.
Does that prove that mind effects matter?
Proof is not a word that is used in science. We can show evidence for. We can create a certain degree of confidence that an effect is what it appears to be. We can make measurements. So what we can say is that we have high confidence at this point that the nature of randomness changes when large-scale world events occur. It's not clear what it proves yet, because it's not even entirely clear what the proof would be of, other than somehow mind and matter are connected, or reflect each other is probably a better way of putting it. I think the mathematics for chaos theory and complexity theory are very solid. Is it a new wacky idea? All new ideas are wacky until they become accepted, and then suddenly they become conservative and orthodox. So, of course, in the beginning of every new application, or especially any idea that is coming off from the side, will be perceived as wacky. And then somebody will get a Nobel Prize and it's not wacky anymore. Which is not to say that all new ideas are equally valid, because some of the wacky ideas coming in are in fact quite wacky. And it's only through the passage of time and the value of science, which is to continually confirm that the idea is true or not, where we begin to get a sense of what is likely to be true versus what is likely to be a fantasy.